If I've not met you, my name is Bill Pearson. I'm the Master here at New College. And so on behalf of the New College community, the trustees of the New College lectures, board and staff, 182 collegians presently living here in this COVID-affected year, another 171 over at New College Postgraduate Village, living with us also, approximately 7,000 alumni, and my beautiful wife Ruth, who's joined us here this evening. May I begin by warmly welcoming everyone who is here present with us this evening. For those who are returning, welcome back, and those joining us for the first time, a warm welcome to you. We feel sparse and few in number in the lecture theatre this year, but over the course of last night, with the lecture last night, approximately 170 people joined us online. So it sort of tells you about how COVID is affecting the attendance at the New College lectures this year. We continue to meet in strange times. As I said on Tuesday night, this is the first time that our lecture is presented via teleconference, but I think general consensus is that the teleconferencing has been working well. Last night we shared a thought-provoking time discussing the vulnerability of freedom. Professor Parkinson shared with us how easy it is for freedoms to be truncated by regulation, and then we had an extensive discussion about how codes of conduct can be used for purposes that perhaps they were never intended. Overnight, this set me thinking about our colleges. We've been talking about implementing staff and student codes of conduct in our colleges, but it set me anew thinking about how communities are regulated and how they function and freedoms and those sorts of things. Now, some people, just if you'll indulge me for a moment, some people look at the Mosaic law of the Old Testament as some sort of wowzerish litany of thou shalt nots designed to stop people from having a bit of fun. Now, previously it had said to me that you actually should see the Mosaic law positively. Feel free to do whatever you like, except just be careful not to do a few of these things. And as Jesus summarised, all of the Mosaic law hung on two quite simple things: love God with everything you have and everything you are, and love your neighbour as yourself. And then moving on to colleges for a moment, young people come and join us and enjoy the great privileges and pleasures of living in community here. And perhaps codes of conduct aren't the way we should go, based on what Patrick shared with us last night. Perhaps we should be focused on having a minimum set of rules to ensure that everybody is able to dwell in peace and safety in our buildings. Feel free to do whatever you like. Just be careful to watch out for these things. It was a great night. Before we commence our time together this evening, I wish to make a couple of acknowledgements again. The first is for those people who have lost close family members during this difficult year. And as I said on previous nights, there are several people in our colleges that are in that situation. The second is the Benedict people, traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to their elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present with us here this evening. So, we pause during this difficult year to return to some important social and legal issues, courtesy of our distinguished lecturer. Those of us who are physically able to be here at New College this evening, wonderful to see you here. Others that are joining us by Facebook live stream, it's great to have you here as well. There will be a summary of material presented on ABC Australia, and I will note that the full transcripts of Professor Parkinson's previous lectures are already available on the ABC Religion and Ethics website. And also, a full recording of the Facebook live stream is available at the New College Community's website from the lectures page. So again, I acknowledge my fellow lecture trustees, the Right Reverend Dr. Michael Stead and Professor David Cohen. I also want to acknowledge representatives of present and former New College boards, Mrs. Janet Simpson, Chair, and her husband, Mr. Ken Simpson, Mrs. Elizabeth and Mr. Tim George, and I think Stephen was coming this evening, Mr. Stephen and Mrs. Margaret Hodgkinson, and Ms. Jane Pangaculum as well. We've got a number of distinguished academic visitors, Professor David Black and his wife Anda, Dr. Gordon Menzies has joined us, Professor Gerald Fogarty, Master of Rain College is here, Professor Michael Lawrence and Mrs. Sarah Lawrence, and Professor Michelle Riondo from Australian Catholic University. and also Reverend Dan Anderson from Trinity Chapel at Macquarie University and Robert Menzies College. As I've said in previous nights, we love questions here at the New College Lectures. Attendees have continued to pepper Professor Parkinson with questions, and he's borne them extremely graciously. The question time seemed to be going really well, and I hope they will do so again this evening. So, after the lecture, if you're here in the building, there are pieces of paper provided on your seats, so if you like old technology, just write your question on the piece of paper, hold it up and someone will collect it from you. For those who are here and watching on live stream, who love their electronic device, the slido.com's website is available. The details are over on my right, your left, and enter the hashtag NCL2020. There are instructions on the email for those that may be Facebooking live stream at home. Briefly, housekeeping, fire alarms, we go out that direction and go straight out of the building, and the bathrooms are over on this side of the building. And before we start, let me just pray briefly for us. Dear Heavenly Father, as we meet here this evening, we thank you for the freedom we have in this country to discuss matters of belief and faith without fear. We again ask for your blessing upon our lecturer this evening, that you will grant to him clarity of thought and expression. And please grant to us all, as we listen and think, knowledge of you and a better understanding of you and your ways in this world. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Please join me in welcoming Professor Patrick Parkinson.
Well, thank you, Master, and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I do wish I could be with you in person, but I'm sure everyone understands the difficulties we have with the border closures at the present time. Well, I began the first two lectures by saying that these are personal views. They don't represent the views of the University of Queensland nor of my law school, of which I am Dean. And that's particularly so tonight, because I don't intend to give you much law, indeed much academic knowledge about families, which is one of my areas of expertise. I want to speak as a Christian tonight, from my heart, from my 40 years or more as a committed member of the faith, and from some of my experience in that respect, looking back over the issues that we discussed in lectures 1 and 2. Well, on Tuesday night, in the first lecture, I presented a dystopian picture of family life in Australia. The Master last night, introducing the lecture, said he felt it was overwhelming. My wife just said it was depressing, so clearly I didn't do a very good job in cheering you up, but it was important to look fairly and squarely, at the evidence of what is happening in family life in Australia. I pointed out that a couple of generations ago, maybe 20% of all children would experience their parents living apart by the age of 15 years old. But by the most recent times, we have 40%. By 2015, 40% of all children and young people experience their parents living apart. And there are real and demonstrable impacts of this on the mental health and well-being of our children and young people. So that was the theme of the first lecture, the importance for children of safe, stable and nurturing families. Well, in the second lecture, we again presented what may have been a rather dystopian picture of the erosion of our freedoms of speech, of religion, of association and conscience. And I talked about how quickly those freedoms are being eroded by a number of different factors in our society. True of Australia, more true probably of many other countries around the Western world. The expansion of notions of hate speech, the weaponization of complaints, there are a number of themes that we explored last night. So tonight I want to bring these things together and to turn to a fundamental question, at least for Christians, but I think for all people of faith really. And that is, how should we then live? That's the title of a book by the great Christian writer Francis Schaeffer 45 years ago, who analysed the cultural trends of his time. But of course, in each generation, we need to revisit it afresh in the light of the culture of our time, our postmodern, post-truth, and post-marital society. How should we as Christians then live in the light of the changes that we have seen which I began to document on Tuesday and Wednesday nights. Well, I want to suggest that, first of all, we have to come to terms with the fact that Christendom is over. As Christians, we need to accept our declining power to influence society. We must face new realities. To the extent that churches have engaged in cultural battles to preserve Christian values as norms for the broader society, we have lost every battle, sooner or later. In terms of family life, as we saw on Tuesday night, we've seen the emergence of no-fault divorce, the equation of marriage and cohabitation as having exactly the same legal effects, and of course the same-sex marriage debate. In terms of the value of human life, we have seen restrictions removed on abortion, and increasingly we are seeing that euthanasia is permitted. And there's a reason for this. To every claim that people of faith make that X or Y should be prohibited or restricted, there is a compelling answer. They say, well, no one is compelling you to have an abortion, or no one is compelling you to marry someone of the same sex. If you don't believe in that, you're free not to do it. But you must accept the freedom of others to do differently. It's a freedom argument, much like the freedom arguments that I gave you last night. And these tend to be compelling arguments in the public square against the notion that our religiously based values should dictate how other people live in a society which is abandoning those values. Now, this does not mean, of course, that we have no arguments to offer in the public square. We can and must argue to protect the defenseless and the vulnerable. As I said last night, we must stand up for freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience. And we do so on behalf of everyone, appealing to our shared values and our heritage of liberty in this country. We must stand up to the thugs who would seek to suppress freedom of debate and shout down any views except their own. We must stand up to the intellectual thugs in the universities. We must challenge those who say they believe in diversity and inclusion, but seek to exclude people of faith or those who hold conservative values. We must criticize and call out the unscientific beliefs on sex and gender, which are now being taught to so many children in Australia. Let me remind you of Jeremiah 29, verse 7. The exiles in Babylon, the Jewish exiles in Babylon, were urged to work for the success of the city to which God had sent them, and to pray to the Lord for the success of that city. As long as we live in the city, its welfare is our welfare. Its success is our success. We cannot separate ourselves in that sense from the world around us. And so too, we who live in a hitherto successful multicultural society in which we enjoy various rights and freedoms should work for the continuing success of that society against those who would seek to destroy social cohesion. Organizations like Freedom for Faith, which I chair, are important in this respect. I do hope you'll consider supporting our work in the public square. We need other think tanks in Australia also that will take ideas influenced by Christian values into our parliaments, both state and federal. And I'll have more to say on that in a few months' time. However, we should have a realistic appreciation of our capacity to influence the society around us. We may win some battles, gain some concessions, but we should not be surprised if our society continues to reject Judeo-Christian values. The tide is still going out on Christendom. Our influence will continue to recede, and the extent to which our laws reflect Christian values and beliefs will continue to diminish. That is in no small part the consequence of our declining numbers. Nominal adherence to a Christian tradition remains quite high in Australia, but church attendance is much lower. Those who pray regularly and who seek to live by Christian codes of behaviour are only a small fraction of those who nominally will say they are Anglican, Catholic, or some other denomination. Christian influence is receding because faith is receding in our society. Now, it's not been easy for church leaders to accept the loss of cultural authority and influence. You see this particularly in the United States, where evangelicals and some Catholics too have invested so much hope in the appointment of reliably conservative judges to the Supreme Court of the United States, such as Neil Gorsuch. This desire to cling to power, whatever the cost, whatever the collateral damage, is misplaced. To quote Psalm 146, verse 3, we must not put our faith in princes, neither presidents nor judges. Blessed, says the psalmist, are those who trust in the Lord their God. Well, talking about the United States leads me to turn to a book which was published 3 years ago. In fact, have the next slide, please. It's a book called The Benedict Option, published in 2017 by Rod Dreher. Its subtitle is A Strategy for Christians in a Post-Christian Nation. New York Times columnist David Brooks described Rod Dreher's volume as the most discussed and important religious book of the decade, and I agree. Dreher, who is of the Eastern Orthodox faith, sees analogies between our time and the fall of the Roman Empire, the collapse of a civilization as was then known. He says we are on the losing side of the culture now. We need to see ourselves as a people in exile, much as those Jewish people were in Babylon all those centuries ago. The book is entitled The Benedict Option, and it refers to Benedict, who was born in 480 AD, just 4 years after the last Roman Empire of the Western Empire abdicated. Last Roman emperor, of the Western Empire abdicated. Benedict sought to live for God in a society that had fallen to barbarians. His famous rule for living a monastic life was about how to order one's life around the constant pursuit of the Lord in a decaying society. Dreher argues that as Christians, we have a decision to make. We can continue to live in this post-Christian world as if nothing has changed, nothing were wrong, but we are at risk of losing our distinctiveness as Christians. The alternative, he says, is to withdraw to some extent from secular society, building strong communities in which we can be educated and discipled in our faith. If we do this, he says, then we have a chance of surviving, just as Benedict all those centuries ago created a means to keep alive the traditions of faith in the monasteries. Now, Dreher's book has been much misunderstood. He does not advocate that we form monasteries. It is not his idea that we should head for the hills. We are called as lay people to live in the world. But if we are to survive in the world, we need to spend sufficient time apart from it, holding on to what we have been given, building our communal bonds. This, he emphasizes, is not a retreat from society. The monasteries that sprang up in Benedict's lifetime and thereafter became repositories for the gospel in the local areas. They taught people about the art of living, which had been forgotten in the barbarian world after the Roman Empire collapsed. And Dreher calls for a similar focus on building strong communities of faith to preserve Christian truth and values in our post-Christian society. He argues that these are the days for building strong arcs for the long journey across a sea of night. Building strong arcs for the long journey across a sea of night. Let me immediately say that I agree with much of Dreher's analysis and what he proposes as the way forward. His is an American context. Our context is different in Australia and different in important ways. Notwithstanding these differences of context, I agree that in the West, we are seeing a fall of Rome moment. Of course, when we speak of a moment, we use that word against the long backdrop of history. Great buildings do not collapse suddenly, or their final demise may be sudden, of course, but that collapse tends to be the result of long-standing erosion within, the crumbling of stone, the weakening of weight-bearing pillars, and in Australia, of course, the steady feasting of white ants. We are not at the stage where great buildings are collapsing, although I fear that we will see some great buildings collapse in the next 4 months or so in the United States before the end of January 2021. Signs of erosion in the fundamental pillars of our society are all around us. An important sign of that irreversible decay is that the foundational principles of the Western tradition, notions of liberty and the rule of law, are under attack from both conservative and progressive factions within our polities. In the United States, again, fundamental values are being attacked from both the left and the right. The dominant narrative on the left of politics is one of victimization and oppression, which overall paints a negative view of modern Western civilization. And I find its echoes, of course, in universities in Australia and in the wider community. On the right of politics in the US, there's a profound disconnect between the values which are espoused and the actions of those in power. The right of politics, under the current presidential administration, is trashing almost every value that the Republican Party once believed in, with the support of Republican members of Congress. And the same is true in other countries as well, Poland being an example. My point is this: a society which has few foundational beliefs cannot long remain unchanged. Well, if I can adapt Rod Dreher's ideas in the Benedict Option to the Australian situation, I believe we need to turn inwards in order to turn outwards. What Dreher is recommending, as I say, is not retreat, not running to the hills, but a renewed focus upon strengthening the foundations of our own communities of faith. If it is a withdrawal, then it is a tactical withdrawal, only in order to strengthen our communities, to better witness to the God who so loved the world that he sent his only Son. Rather than the image of the monastery, let me offer you another image instead. It is that of a city set on a hill that cannot be hidden. Some 40 years ago, I had the privilege of traveling in Israel, and I stood on the hillside in Galilee where, according to tradition, the Sermon on the Mount was preached. And in that sermon, Jesus said, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden." And from that hillside, if you look behind you, you can see nestled into the side of the cliff the ancient city of Safed. I understand it is more than 4,000 years old. Of course, when I saw it, it was different to the way in which Jesus would have seen it. The modern city of Safed, still looking very ancient, has medieval walls. But it was there then, and it's very visible. It is 900 meters above sea level, and it's said to be the highest city in Israel. And it's easy to imagine Jesus pointing to that city and saying, "See, a city set on a hill cannot be hidden." And that is how the church should be, a visible witness to others of the kingdom of God. Well, a few years ago, before same-sex marriage was made lawful by decision of the US Supreme Court, I spent a few days in Washington, D.C., talking with leaders about religious freedom. It was a very interesting few days. One of the people I spoke to was a top official of the American Catholic Bishops' Conference. I asked him how the Catholic bishops were responding to the debates on same-sex marriage, which were then dividing the US. He said, "We must recatechize the flock about what marriage means and why it is important." By this, he meant the bishops needed to persuade their own people afresh about Christian teaching on marriage and win the debate, at least amongst their own people, amongst the flock. Well, the debate on same-sex marriage is over now in Australia as it is in the United States. Christendom is over. But it's worth thinking about that expression, to recatechize the flock. To catechize is to educate, to persuade. We need to persuade believers of the fundamental wisdom of Christian teaching on sex and family relationships. I prefer to say that we need to re-evangelize the flock. This is a task of positive persuasion. It does not involve attacks on anyone, criticisms of anyone's lifestyle, denigration of same-sex couples, single parents, or anybody else. No, It is a positive story we need to tell. Good news, not condemnation. As Glyn Harrison has written, we need to tell a better story. Why adhering to a Christian understanding of marriage, involving the union of a man and a woman for life to the exclusion of all others, offers a pathway to happiness that may well elude those who have abandoned Christian beliefs. In the past, the way we've taught about family life has involved explaining rules about sex before marriage, rules about sex outside of marriage, rules about the grounds for divorce, rules about same-sex relationships. I suspect that such a traditional way of delivering Christian teaching on that subject now will not gain traction amongst young people today. There are problems with rules. The first is that the Bible's teaching is not always all that clear. The second is that a focus on rules emphasizes only the negative. We have to persuade, not just to prohibit. The Bible is not always crystal clear. Take the Bible's teaching on divorce. Of course, the central message of Jesus is unequivocal. Marriage is intended to be a lifelong commitment. What God has joined together, as we talked about on Tuesday night, let no one separate. But Jesus clearly allowed an exception for adultery. Paul had an exception for desertion by an unbelieving spouse. And anyone working with families will know that there are other situations, particularly continuing domestic violence and child abuse, where maintenance of the marital relationship is quite simply unsafe for one or more of the members of the family. And theologians cannot agree on the rules about whether marriage should be permitted and in what circumstances, nor is there agreement on the place of grace and forgiveness for those whose marriages failed. Or if we want to talk about fault, how we sort out who was at fault, who made the decision to leave, and who was left, and why. It's a feature of the Western tradition that on the basis of historical accounts of the life and teaching of Jesus, narratives of Jesus' life, letters of Paul, Peter, and others that have come down to us, that we want to erect a legal code, a body of rules, a theological framework for doctrine that does not deal with complexity or with human frailty very well. I gravely leave such matters to the theologians. And in Titus 2, verse 10, it talks about making the teaching about God, our Saviour, attractive. We need to find ways afresh to make the teachings of Christ attractive, to show young people in particular why Christian teachings provide such good and important rules for life. Emphasizing the prohibitions is part of the story, of course. It has to be, but perhaps we've done too much of that over the last few centuries without making Christian teaching about marriage and family life attractive. Let me read you William Blake's famous poem written in 1794. It's called The Garden of Love. I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst where I used to play on the green. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the garden of love that so many sweet flowers bore. And I saw it was filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be. And priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. If what we present is a set of rules only that bind with briars people's joys and desires, we may find that we are unable to persuade our adherents of the wisdom of Christian teaching. Contrast William Blake's account of Christian teaching on sex and marriage with that of John Chrysostom. John lived from about 345 to 407 AD. Amongst the early writers in the Christian church, perhaps none had such a positive and fulsome understanding of marriage as did John Chrysostom. John used his pulpit in Antioch to guide his congregants' households and relationships, instructing them how to live their married lives. For example, he denounced the idea that marriage negotiations should be about money and property. Marriage, he wrote, is not a business venture, but a fellowship for life. He taught that marriage must be marked by constant and open communication, and this included sexual communication between spouses. Clearly, he wasn't English. He taught that there should be joy and delight in marital sex. Men and women should not be ashamed at what is honourable or blush at what is undefiled. He also taught that the couple should treat their finances as being common, for each owns, invests in, and depends upon the other's life, labour and livelihood. You see this radical equality in Christian teaching. Once you are married, he taught, you should abandon the notion that this is mine and that is yours. Your money is not your own. And this very fulsome endorsement of the idea of marriage stands in contrast to so much of the asceticism that has characterized Christian teaching about sex. How would our churches be different if we had John Chrysostom's teaching on sex and marriage, rather than the dour and forbidding attitudes portrayed in William Blake's poem? As Christians, we have a very good story to tell about the wisdom of Christian teaching, but it involves a paradox we need to give up in order to gain. To make a commitment to a man or woman for life to the exclusion of others involves a major level of sacrifice. It means committing to the other for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others. For many of us, perhaps especially for men, that involves a choice to resist the temptation of other relationships, to resist the thought that the grass may be greener on the other side of the marital fence. We need to talk afresh about the value of commitment, pushing through the tough times and adverse circumstances to a time beyond when our relationships will again sail through more tranquil waters. We need to talk about the rewards that come from what I described on Tuesday night as the discipline of denial. And the evidence of those rewards is there for all to see in the data on the benefits of marriage to happiness and well-being. On your screen there, I'm showing you a graph from a survey of nearly 10,000 people in 11 countries in North and South America, Europe, and also Australia. And these were all countries which have had a predominantly Christian heritage. And what the researchers found was that women in highly religious relationships are about 50% more likely to report that they are strongly satisfied with their sexual relationship than their secular and less religious counterparts. Let me just show you on that graph, on the left-hand side are those who have no faith at all. They never go to church. And you see that the sexual satisfaction of men and women is almost the same, slightly higher for women. Then in the middle, you see less mixed religious couples. These are couples for the most part who go to church less than once a month. They may go occasionally, but they don't go very often. And then there's 13% within that group in the study who, where there's one partner who does go to some faith community and the other one doesn't. But they're not together as couples sharing a strong faith. And then on the right-hand side, you see the sexual satisfaction for those who are highly religious, who do attend church or another congregation on a very regular basis. And you see that for men, as well as women, rates of sexual satisfaction are very much higher than in the other two groups. And for women in particular, very, very much higher. As I say, 50% higher. This is a large study in 11 countries. And if we turn to the next slide and look at relationship quality, we see exactly the same pattern. We see that on the left-hand side, those who have no faith at all, men and women are almost equally satisfied with their relationship. Those who occasionally go to a church or other religious community, men slightly higher than women, but not very different from those who have no faith at all. But highly religious couples show a significantly higher level of satisfaction in their relationship. We have a good story to tell. And so we need to put every effort into supporting family relationships to be stable, safe, and nurturing. In this regard, we have much to do, I may say, on safe relationships. That same survey, which I've just described, found that men who are highly religious were not significantly less likely to engage in violence against their partners. That's shocking. They're also not less likely to commit adultery than men who have no religious faith. So if that's representative of the Christian community, then we have work to do. We have work to do to address relationship-destroying behavior in the community of faith. Well, turning to the next slide, a city set on the hill can be a place of refuge for those outside of the city, a source of sustenance to the needy in the surrounding areas. We do not strengthen the foundations and structures of our city for our own sake, but for the society around us. And when it comes to family relationships, the stability and nurture which so supports the mental health of children, we do have a better story to tell to the community. We can take a lead in community education and the support of families going through difficulties. From our strong city, we can support others who do not have the same level of support. Local churches could do much more to offer education about how to develop safe, stable, and nurturing families, taking as our starting point this better story that Christians can tell. We cannot leave it to the secular relationship organizations who are very much affected in some cases by the spirit of the age, by the very values that are not healthy for families. How do we do this? How do we break through in people's lives? Well, I think we need to look for the golden moments in people's lives when they are open to receiving information and changing the way they view things. One very innovative program in the United States that has had some success is called the Becoming Parents program. It was designed for couples who are having their first child together. And it's based upon those preparation courses that community health centres offer in Australia to prepare soon-to-be parents for the process of birth and caring for the newborn child. You know, the sort of thing explaining to soon-to-be parents about the later parts of pregnancy, the birth process, how women should breathe, how men should support or stay out of the way, one or the other. These programs are very common and they are very important in preparing soon-to-be parents for the process of the birth and the responsibilities that occur thereafter. Well, the Becoming Parents program was designed by a nursing expert in Seattle, Dr. Pam Jordan, with whom I've spoken. Her program includes the traditional information that prepares couples for childbirth. The goal is to prepare them for parenthood as well, and to help strengthen the couple's relationship at a time when they're particularly open to information and advice and seeking to build a long-term family life together. Dr. Pam Jordan is a nurse in a university there. So what the program does is it focuses on reducing the challenges of new parenthood by strengthening the couple's resilience and by promoting self-care and community support, as well as providing research-based information about infant communication and development. Its goal is to equip couples for strong relationships and confident parenting, fostering children's ability to thrive. When I talked to Pam about it, she told me of what they did in Oklahoma in one of the early trials of the program. They were asked by the government to work particularly with low socioeconomic groups, where relatively few couples married. There were a lot of unmarried, soon-to-be mums in that group. And a significant part of the program involved talking about marriage. And indeed, at the very end of the programs, they would have weddings. Very simple. The exchange of vows before family, friends, other people in the group that did not need to cost the earth. And they would have 1 or 2 weddings at the end of such a program. Well, one of the impediments to marriage is that there is a cultural expectation that weddings have to be expensive. A large feast put on traditionally by the bride's family for all the relatives and friends on either side, for all those uncles and aunts that you haven't seen for many years and don't wish to see again for many years. The wedding industry makes the most of that special day, charging premium pricing for every service offered. But it doesn't need to be that way. As churches, we need to find ways to celebrate people's unions which do not leave them or their families with huge amounts of debt. We can be creative in all sorts of ways about this. If I may speak personally for a moment, my wife Martha and I have our own sad experiences of family breakdown, as I said on Tuesday night. For neither of us was it our choice, but there we are. But ours is therefore a second marriage for both of us. When we got married some 12 years ago, it meant for Martha not only a new stage of her life, but also leaving the Baptist church on the central coast of New South Wales, where she had spent so many years. She'd been part of the music ministry for that time, and the church members were not just friends, they were an extended family. They'd supported her through the good times and the hard times. So the wedding was, yes, a union of our lives, but it was also a kind of farewell, for after that we were going to be living down in Sydney. So we held the wedding about half an hour after the end of the normal service on a Sunday morning, deliberately. We even thought about holding it during the service, but the pastor thought it might be better just to have a little pause and then have the wedding afterwards. And people in the church brought food to a potluck lunch. Some very kind person decided he wanted to order and pay for a large cake. Another volunteered to videotape the wedding. The wedding was a community celebration, a farewell to Martha, and a blessing of her church family on our new life together as a couple. There's no reasons why weddings need to bankrupt people. There's no reason why money should be an impediment for a young couple who want to take that step. Well, local churches can also be involved in supporting struggling families. Nearly 30 years ago, I was involved in a little uniting church congregation in Blaxland in the Lower Blue Mountains. For Sydney Anglicans present, it was an evangelical congregation, let me assure you. Well, we had a small cottage on our grounds, adjacent to the main road, that we weren't using. As a church, we saw the need to reach out to the local community around us. And so based in that little 5-row cottage, supported by initial grant from the Wesley Mission, we established the Lower Mountains Family Support Service to support local families who were struggling. Initially, this relied to a considerable extent on volunteers from the church who would provide practical support to single mums, would offer friendship to people in need. The service ran workshops, including programs for people going through divorce. Well, now, 30 years on, it is known as Gateway Family Services, and it provides support all across the Blue Mountains and Penrith areas. It has 22 staff and over 100 volunteers working with it in various ways. Just a few days ago, I got an email from the Chief Executive Officer saying that it was continuing to hold to the values of those who founded it, to be the hands and feet of Jesus in the local area. And there's no doubt a multitude of other examples we could cite of the church in action, which involves local churches reaching out to local communities. The pandemic has created huge demands on some churches for support, from people needing food parcels and other kinds of help. Take City Hope Church in Ipswich, Queensland. In the first 2 weeks after the COVID-19 lockdown in Queensland, demand for hampers of food and other goods increased 500%. And I'm told that it has remained at that level ever since. The value of the goods distributed in April 2019, 1 year earlier, was just a few $100s per week. But by April 2020, the first month of the lockdown, it had increased to $13,000 per week. This is a church doing wonderful work, reaching out to its local community, but it comes at a cost. It involves sacrificial giving. Well, this model of local church involvement in meeting community needs is perhaps a different one than the church has embraced in the past. We've tended to concentrate our social outreach in large welfare organisations, Uniting Care, Catholic Care, Anglicare, Baptist Care, and others. Well, they've done great work. They continue to do great work. But precisely because of their huge size and heavy reliance upon government funding, they have struggled to remain overtly Christian organisations. They may also be somewhat disconnected from local churches that seek to reach out to the community around them. For this reason, these very large welfare organisations, while they do great work, have a very limited role to play in this new vision I want to offer of how local churches can turn inwards in order to turn outwards, to strengthen family life in the faith community in order to better support others who are struggling. We need new models, new ways of doing things, new initiatives, new inspiration. Well, it's not just supporting safe, stable, and nurturing families, critical as that is. It's also about building community for those who are not in family units. These communities can then better welcome others. If current marriage rates continue, around 30% of young people in Australia today will never marry. Remember that in 2017, it was the lowest marriage rate on record in Australia, around half of the number per 1,000 population who married in 1970. Now, the fact that 30% at least will never marry in their lives doesn't mean they won't have intimate partnerships. No, of course. Some will live in de facto relationships for a time. Some of those will be same-sex, a few of them. But as I said to you the other night, less than 1% of all couples in Australia are actually same-sex couples. And those who live in de facto relationships may find that they don't last. That seems to be the pattern. Even when there are children, they are very much more unstable than marriages are, as we talked about on Tuesday night. So putting all of this together, our local communities will necessarily comprise a lot of people who are single, separated, or divorced. Not just young adults who have yet to form a marriage partnership, which has been the traditional focus of churches, but people of all ages who are single by choice, single because they've not found a suitable partnership, or single by shipwreck. For many people in this situation, the greatest problem they face is loneliness. To be sure, all of us have a family of origin, although relationships may be strained in some cases. And in a highly mobile society, that family may be in a different country, perhaps on the other side of the world. Loneliness may not be a crushing problem when we are in the midst of busy working lives, but when the busyness of day-to-day existence recedes, for many that loneliness will be more keenly felt. Christian communities will need to find new ways of including those who are single but not by choice. Let me quote you from Psalm 68, verses 5 and 6 in the New International Version. God is a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in his holy dwelling. God sets the lonely in families. We need to build communities around families and set the lonely in families and communities where they can feel a sense of belonging and love and support. Well, what has all this got to do with religious freedom? It is essential for this new orientation, this way of reaching out to our local communities, that we retain the freedom to be Christian organisations. And I would say the same, of course, for groups from other faiths in our multicultural society. Jewish organisations, Muslim organisations, Hindu organisations, Sikh organisations, and so on. As I was explaining last night, the freedom of faith-based organisations to be faith-based organisations is under serious threat in Australia because it relies upon exemptions in anti-discrimination laws. And what's behind all of this is a misguided and fundamentalist idea of what equality is. Underlying the campaign against exemptions are two beliefs that are stated with a dogmatism that is as powerful and rigid as any belief system of religious groups. The first is a belief that all limitations on who is eligible to apply for particular jobs should be abolished or severely restricted in the name of one conceptualization of equality, even if 99.9% of all the other jobs in the community are open to that person. This position involves taking a very restrictive approach to what are called genuine occupational requirements in the law as a ground for exceptions in anti-discrimination laws. But the second fundamentalist aspect of that campaign arises from a belief that the only human rights that should be given any real significance are individual rights and not group rights. And this can make advocates disregard the competing claims of groups which would justify a right of positive selection of staff in order to enhance the cohesion and identity of a religious or a cultural organisation. The result is a serious threat to faith-based institutions, including in particular Christian schools, but also welfare organisations. And in the coming years, those Christian schools, and I think Christian tertiary institutions, are going to be some of our monasteries, some of our ways in which we can transmit and keep alive Christian teaching to the next generation. So the argument is, from those who want to abolish these exemptions, that all jobs ought to be open to all people, that there should be no discrimination against anyone on the basis of their faith or the lack of it. Advocates for this position concede that a Christian school ought to be able to insist upon having a Christian school principal, if they so wish, and that the chaplain should be a Christian too. But they cannot understand why the maths teacher needs to be a Christian, or the school counsellor, or the receptionist at the front desk, or the gardener. In other words, they fail to understand how the Christian school is an outworking of Christian community, a visible manifestation of faith. Well, the answer to it is that Christianity is not just about religious studies. Christianity affects every area of life. You know, when I was growing up in the UK, it used to be said that Welsh is the language of heaven, usually by the Welsh, of course. It is actually a beautiful language, a melodic language. Well, Welsh may be the language of heaven, but maths is the language of God. In the order of creation, there is maths. Maths is written into the very order of creation. So when you are studying maths, you are studying something of God. And when you are studying something of God and his creation, you're seeing maths. So the idea that the maths teacher doesn't need to be a Christian, well, that assumes a very narrow view of what faith means, what faith involves. My wife, Martha, who I mentioned earlier, has spent 25 years or so teaching maths. And when she was teaching in Christian schools, she'd quite often bring Christian insights into her teaching of maths. Well, there are those who want to minimize that and say, well, 99.9% of jobs should be open to every teacher, and therefore only the principal, maybe the chaplain, should those jobs be restricted to people of faith, even in a Christian school. And the same argument for Jewish schools, Muslim schools, and so on. Well, this threat to religious freedom is real and it's serious. And it is because these ideas have now been embraced by a minor party, the Greens, and by at least one large part of the Labour Party. Nowhere, perhaps, is the threat to religious freedom greater than in Victoria. In 2010, the Labour government, the state Labour government, put through Parliament the Equal Opportunity Act in such a way as to severely limit the freedom of Christian schools to prefer Christian staff. The effect of the legislation was that religious organisations which wanted to select staff to share in the religious beliefs and values of the organisation had to meet a very high legal threshold. Religious bodies and schools were required to show that conforming with the doctrines, beliefs, or principles of their religion is an inherent requirement of the job, and that the person discriminated against does not meet that inherent requirement because of a relevant attribute. Well, this would have had serious effects for the right of independent schools to select staff that share the faith and values of the school. The term inherent requirement has been very narrowly interpreted by the courts to refer only to those functions that are a necessary part of the job. Take, for example, the protected ground of religious belief. A Christian school would have to show that it is an inherent requirement of being a history teacher to hold to the tenets of the Christian faith in order to justify not selecting a history teacher for employment who was very well qualified for the job, but unsupportive of the religious ethos of the school. Well, fortunately, that law didn't last long because an election was held, a coalition government came into power, and one of its promises was to amend that legislation again. And so the legislation was amended and the original form was reinstated. But elections come and go, and in 2016, a Labour government under Dan Andrews was in power, and the Andrews government tried again. It introduced a bill to restore the version of the Act that had been passed in 2010. Mark Sneddon, the Executive Director of the Institute of Civil Society and a board member of Freedom for Faith, explained very well the difficulties this would create. The bill, he said, undermines the freedom of association of citizens to establish and maintain voluntary associations which express and promote particular views of what is good and right. The bill was a fundamental attack, not just on freedom of religion, but on freedom of association of religious organizations. Well, fortunately, it was narrowly defeated in the upper house by only one vote. But these attacks on freedom of religion and association will come again. The attacks by a state Labour government on freedom of religion and association and similar noises which were being made in the Federal Party are, in my view, a significant reason why so many people of faith, and not just Christians, felt uncomfortable about supporting Labour in the last federal election. Please understand, I don't want to be political in these lectures, and for myself, I have been for a long time a swinging voter. So it's not about politics, it is about faith. It is about freedom. It is about freedom of religion and association. In the last federal election, the evidence is fairly clear that people of faith turned against Labour. In the inner cities, largely populated by people in well-paid professional jobs, the Labour vote went up significantly, not only in Labour seats, but also in seats held by the coalition as well. But the Labour vote went backwards in constituencies with a large number of adherents to a religious faith, not just Christian faith, but Islam and other faiths as well. This was particularly true in several constituencies in Western Sydney. It was also true in Queensland. It was no doubt the case elsewhere also. You see, for people of faith, freedom of association is an existential issue. And it's also an existential issue in terms of what it means to be a multicultural society. Joel Harrison and I explained in an article a few years ago that anti-discrimination laws have an important role to play in the commons of our national life. And we touched on this briefly last night in the Q&A session. There cannot be discrimination in employment, education, or other sectors in the areas of our life where we meet on common ground. This is the commons. However, beyond the commons are those ethnic, cultural, and religious communities which are so important to people as places where they can find community, acceptance and support. And acceptance and support for their values and their beliefs. There is absolutely no reason or public policy why a Croatian social club should not prefer to employ Croatians in that social club. Nobody's harmed. There's no reason or public policy why an environmental organisation should not insist that all its employees share the beliefs and values of the organisation. This is not rocket science, it's just common sense. But equally, there is no reason of public policy why a Muslim school should not be entitled to maintain its Islamic culture and ethos by choosing or preferring staff who adhere to the Islamic faith. Parents have a choice. They can send their children to the local state school. They can send them to any number of different independent schools. They can send them to a religious school. And what the government does is to fund all these schools on an objective basis, irrespective of what the foundations are in terms of the philosophy or otherwise of the school. So if we abolish or severely restrict freedom of association, then we do much to damage what it means to be a multicultural society, and we reduce the capacity of faith communities to meet the needs of local communities around them in the way that I have described. We will not set up organizations to reach out to the poor or the vulnerable, to care for families who are struggling, to provide support for those who are lonely and isolated, if we cannot do so as Christian organizations expressing the love of Christ through our actions. And the same freedom of association that is an existential issue for Christians is an issue for Jewish organizations, Muslim organizations, Hindu organizations, and others beside. And it's critical to having a healthy and successful multicultural society. This is what today's religious freedom arguments are all about. This is what the argument about exemptions is really all about. These are arguments about what it means to live in a harmonious, multicultural society. Well, let me conclude, possibly to your relief. In the last 3 nights, we have traversed a lot of territory. I will not attempt to summarize it now, except to say this, that comfortable as we are in Australia, wealthy as we are, or at least wealthy as we were before the pandemic hit, and successful as we are in so many ways, we've not chosen as a society wise pathways when it comes to family life. There's a reaping of a whirlwind here. A whirlwind of consequences in terms of the mental health and well-being of our nation, in particular, our children and young people. We're also experiencing growing and ever more serious threats to our freedoms, as I've explained. It is a different time now. Christendom is over. The tide of Christian faith is receding in our society. And we must adapt to these new circumstances, not fearfully, but realistically. We need to accept that we are no longer living in a society sympathetic to the Christian faith. We need to realize that the problems we are seeing in family life are issues also for the churches. We need to re-evangelize our flock of the wisdom of Christian teaching on sex and family life, while acknowledging and responding to issues such as domestic violence and child abuse. And as I say, we need to be like a city set on a hill which cannot be hidden, a shining example of a community which supports safe, stable, and nurturing families. That is what I think Rodrier describes as the Benedict Option. But it is not a matter of running to the hills. We need to turn inwards in order to turn outwards, to reach out to our local communities in meeting the variety of needs there are around us, which I fear will become ever more pressing as society decays further. But to do this, we have to preserve freedom of association, a right which is threatened by those who have a narrow and deficient understanding of equality. There is much to be done. There's much to be done in the public square, standing up for our values. There's much to be done in the universities. We have enormous capacity as the people of God. And we have a God who will empower us to adapt and succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Parkinson. As I said at the beginning, we have now a time for questions for the lecturer. I can see a piece of paper being held up down the front here, so someone's going to come and collect that. And over here we have the details of how to present your question to the lecturer. Go to slido.com and enter the hashtag NCL2020. And so I will begin by addressing questions that are already appearing. The first question. With regards to the Benedictine option, should the surprises of living memory, such as the fall of the Soviet Union or the appearance of COVID, humble us about predicting God's future?
Yes, we have to be very humble indeed about predicting the future. Just in the last few months, I've been looking over books written in the 60s and 70s, and they were so wrong on so many things. And if you are part of a church community or have been for any length of time, you may well have read those books which seek to interpret Revelation to our present time, the late, great planet Earth, these sorts of things. Largely wrong. A lot of the predictions about technology have proven largely wrong. So, of course, I may be wrong too, and I say that with all humility. I'm looking at the signs of the time as I see it.
Thank you. You mentioned that it can be difficult for large Christian welfare organisations to maintain their Christian identity. Do you think there's less a danger for a more local model, and if so, why?
The reason why I say it is much less of a danger for a local model, or indeed not a problem at all for a local model, is that I see these services, these ways of supporting local families, local communities through food banks and in all sorts of other ways, as being directly the witness of the local church. So they are the people in the city set on a hill, leaving the city to go out and reach out to others, to give them support from the city or to bring them into the city. So it's a model very closely aligned to the witness of the local church in their local community. That is what I see as the way forward. And in England, there are wonderful examples of this. There's an organisation formed by a friend of mine, Martin Charlesworth. Martin and I went to Oxford together so many years ago. Martin is a leading pastor in England, and Jubilee Plus gives support and advice to local churches on how to reach out to their community in the sorts of ways I've described, how to bring the love of Christ in action in all sorts of different ways. And there's some great models of how to do that, supported by the wider Christian church within the UK. It's called Jubilee Plus. You can go to its website and see some of the examples. So, no, I don't see an issue about local churches losing their saltiness. I don't see that. Because the sorts of ministries we may start and may get involved with, they may have other volunteers as well, but they will be grounded in the life and community and faith of the local church.
This next question we dear to the hearts of collegians. Given the panorama presented of our country's future, what advice should we give to concerned young people about the qualities they should look for in a future marriage partner?
Yeah, right. I'm not a counsellor. And that's ducking the question, I understand that. But I think it's really important to know the inward character of somebody, to know whether they have values which are more than superficial and that they are trustworthy. And one of the things about beginning a sexual relationship too early, I think, is that can distort the relationship and make it harder to see the things about the other which are warning bells, because sex takes over to a very significant extent, and the need to continue to have that sexual excitement becomes a driving force in the relationship. And so I think there is wisdom, as I said on Tuesday night, about holding back, because you need to be able to take the time to see whether this other person has values that go more than skin deep, is trustworthy, is compatible with you, that you could be together one. You might be very different, but in that complementarity, there can be union. Beyond that, I'll leave it to those who are much more expert and successful than I.
Thank you. Religious freedom should apply equally to all, but is there a line? For example, to prevent abuse of women and or children? Some would argue that Christian sexual suppression also crosses that line. Who gets to choose? Which human rights have no exception?
Well, thank you for the question. The answer is that no human rights have no exceptions. And this is made clear in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, where again and again, when you have a right described, it says this right is subject to the to public health and morality and safety and the rights and freedoms of others, or words to that effect. And that's a very necessary qualification, of course. We can't support female genital mutilation just because it may or may not have a religious basis to it. And there's all sorts of other practices, which some of which are really more cultural than religious, but which are harmful. And so we must always have that qualification. Of course, we have to have national security agencies, which are policing religious organizations which are promoting violence or have a strong tendency to do so. So living in a society, there are limits to religious freedom. And I can't go with the question to suggest that sexual suppression is in some way a violation of human rights. It's a voluntary decision. Your body is your own. You make your decisions. Nobody's forcing you. So, no, I wouldn't go with you on that. But clearly there are and must be limitations to religious freedom, and freedom for faith, and the church leaders with whom I've worked on these issues absolutely recognise that those limitations must exist.
Thank you. Your talk seemed to assume that Christendom was a good thing. Yet, as evidenced, particularly in the US at the moment, the marriage of Christianity with politics and power can lead to a warped and politicised Christianity. Could the death of Christendom ultimately be a good thing for the Church?
Well, thank you for the question. When I talk about Christendom, though, I look over a very long spectrum of history, and I look across the Western world. The values which have underpinned Western societies, Western liberties, Western freedoms, indeed, the very value of the individual as having human rights comes from Christian teaching. There's a very fine book by Larry Siedentop on this called The Invention of the Individual. It's published about 5 or 6 years ago. And he takes us through the history of this in terms of the way in which Christianity brought dignity to human beings, and in particular to women. The way in which Christianity changed the values of society, promoting equality. And the fundamental ideas that we have inherited of human rights derive, to no small extent, to a very significant extent indeed, from Christian teaching. Ideas of natural law, which have their origins in Christian thought. Christianity was to the Western legal tradition as the womb is to human life. So it's played an incredibly important role. And the loss of that influence is the loss, in my view, of Western society. It's like we have plucked a plant out from its roots. You can put it in a vase, and for a while it will survive. But without the roots which are deep in the ground, which nurtured it, it may not long survive. And that is where I see we are at in the West now. That is why I say we're at a fall of Rome moment. So I look beyond the immediate. I look beyond the appalling mess, frankly, that American evangelicals have made in their alliance with Trump. This is an immediate issue. I look at the span of history and I look around the Western world. And it's from that perspective that I say that we're going into a long, dark night.
Thank you. How can those of us who are part of the flock encourage the re-persuasion of the flock and not some rule-based doctrine that is so often, or seems so often, talked about in our churches?
I'm a lawyer. I don't know. I'm not a pastor. And I say that in all seriousness because I think this is just the conversation we need to have. I share it with you. But in our local churches and those who are here tonight or watching on live stream or will see the video later, I think these are conversations we need to have. And it'd be a good idea to engage young people in that conversation. So all I am saying, though, is that I just don't think the rules-based approach to things, the prohibitions, the thou shalt nots, is going to be effective with the generation of young people who I teach and with whom I work. And I'm not alone in that view. I've talked to a number of pastors who say the same thing. So we do need to tell a better story, a positive story. And I think we need to talk together about how best to convey that to the next generation of young people, the next generation of Christian leaders. The thing is that I think we avoid so many of these conversations. We pretend that the problem doesn't exist. I think we have to be honest that it does. And then to have the conversations in church communities, in local churches, but in the national church leadership on how best we do this and to build national resources to tell that positive story and to promote safe, stable and nurturing families.
Thank you. Given what you've said about the importance of Christian schools, is there still a place for Christian families at state schools?
Look, there absolutely is. And for every parent, you have to make the choices which suit you, suit your budget, which is also important, and suit the needs of the child. I mentioned on Tuesday night that we had an interesting journey as a united family, Martha and I, and we had 3 kids who went to 3 different schools. One went to a strong Christian school, one went to a state school, and the third went to a school which had a strong Christian foundation, but was not only employing Christian staff. And each of them benefited from the school to which they attended. So I don't think there are absolute rules on this. But I do think, looking into the long-term future, if I'm right and if Rodri is right and others are right, we're going to see increasing decay in our societies, increasing irrationality in the ideas being presented to school children. And the way we may need to protect our children is by sending them to Christian schools. It's vital that this is a strong option. And I think we'll see and need to see the growth of Christian tertiary institutions as well for the same reason.
As a Baptist, the experience of the dissenting churches in the UK in the 17th and 18th century under the established church might be a closer parallel in the Benedict of the experience Christians are likely to face in the future. Any thoughts on other historical parallels that we can learn from?
Well, there's a very interesting question. I do think that we have some more recent models. One of the privileges I had in my younger life, and I haven't shared this in these lectures before, was to spend 9 months in Czechoslovakia during the communist period. And officially I was a British Council scholar in socialist family law. I can't tell you that I worked terribly hard, but they thought I worked hard, which will tell you something about their society. But I was part of a local evangelical Slovak church in Bratislava. They were wonderful to me. And I did work quietly, secretly with a Catholic underground movement, which was extraordinary in its impact. Rod Dreher, as it happens, is just about to publish another book, which talks about the Slovak church. For some reason, we happen to have that other connection between us, and we've been in dialogue about it. I learned so much about what it meant to be a Christian in persecution through being part of the family of that church in Bratislava. I had friends who experienced persecution firsthand. I had a friend who was thrown out of medical school because he began an essay by saying, "Ja som Christian," I am a Christian. I saw it at first hand, but I also saw the incredible strength, the incredible love of that Christian community and the strength of their family life. And that saw them through those very hard times. And I saw the courage and the bravery of my friends in the Catholic underground who risked certainly their freedom, but probably their lives in order to share the gospel with their friends. You know, they used John Stott's Basic Christianity, smuggled in from the West, as their textbook. So there are recent examples in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union of what it means to live in some very difficult times and how you can survive and thrive as a church in that environment.
Thank you. How much of this lack of a Christian vision for society, and therefore the decline in Christendom, is due to the modern evangelical church's relative suspicion of getting involved in social justice and societal issues, sometimes seeing it as a distraction from the central goal of evangelism?
Well, thank you for the question. And I've had the privilege of being part of all sorts of evangelical churches over the years in England, in Australia, and in other countries where I have been able to spend some months. And I think there are, as you would imagine, enormous variations in that. But I do remember the Christian Union at Oxford, which had this very narrow view of what Christianity meant. It was all about evangelism, huge suspicion, as you say, of the social gospel. The social gospel was betrayal of what Christianity should be. That was the view. Well, at different times, you may need different emphases. And I think in a society which still has a cultural memory of faith, where a lot of people know the Bible stories, if you tell them the story of the Good Samaritan, they'll have some inkling of what you're talking about. In those societies, there is common ground when one explains what the gospel is and how Jesus can change your life. But we're in a society now where that common ground is receding, where that knowledge, that cultural memory of faith is receding. And so we have to find other ways to find common ground with people, ways to engage with them in ways which matter to them, not just in ways that matter to us. And when you don't have that common ground, speaking about faith, evangelizing, is simply sharing what matters to you without necessarily connecting with what matters to them, or with a worldview which they can begin to relate to and understand. So I think as we move into the future, we have to look at other ways of finding common ground. To go back to the statement supposedly said by St. Francis, preach the gospel by all means, and if necessary, use words. That again might be the motto for our time.
Thank you. Laws can be blocked under our political system by minor parties, but can only be created by major parties in general. How should Christians engage in the political process to best protect the rights and the ability to protect Christian values?
Well, thank you again for the question, and thank you for all the questions. They are excellent. I think it is absolutely critical that Christians remain involved in more than one party, indeed several parties, and remain bipartisan in all their engagements with the political world. In Freedom for Faith, that's something we hold very dear. We talk to the coalition government, we talk to the Labour Party as well. We would talk to other minor parties if they would have that dialogue with us, as I said last night. And I think it's very, very important not to treat one side of politics as somehow pro-Christian, the other one anti. We can get locked into fruitless arguments and negative ways of thinking if we do that. We need to find with the left of politics the common ground around concern for the poor and the vulnerable, concern for refugees. I'm not saying the right of politics doesn't care about those things. I'm just saying that different political parties tend to have different emphases because of their histories and their support bases. And it's really important, I think, that therefore we have that dialogue with both sides of politics, all sides of politics, and we don't in any way identify the Christian gospel with the gospel of one political party. So it really is important, I think, that Christians are involved in the mainstream parties and seek to be a Christian voice in that. Because, as I was saying last night, what we're seeing is a society which is moving towards the extremes. The impact of social media is to amplify the voices of the angriest, of the most extreme. We're seeing some extreme ideas coming out of the universities. And so we need to moderate that in our political parties, in our governments, by those who are much more grounded in fundamental values and beliefs of our tradition as a society.
Thank you. What role should or could theological colleges play in equipping local churches with leaders who can effect the kind of new initiatives that you have highlighted this evening?
Thank you for the question. I need to answer it carefully, I think. The energy in England, the energy which is described and supported by an organisation like Jubilee Plus that I mentioned, is actually an energy coming from lay people, from ordinary people. Actually, Christian business people have been playing a really big role in developing these local initiatives. Let me take the example of a food bank. Somebody who's a Christian entrepreneur who's had years of experience in building organizations can be enormously helpful in helping a local church to establish a food bank. And the sort of things which are happening in England are initiatives by social entrepreneurs. They may develop a model for a food bank, a legal structure, a logo, a way of explaining what the program is to the local supermarkets to see if they'll get buy-in from local supermarkets, and so on and so forth. And they can give that model to a local church. And all that the local church needs to do is to put its name on the top. So that's a model which is proving, as I understand it, very effective in the UK. But it's not coming from the pastors. It's not coming from the national church leaders. It's coming from very savvy and very experienced lay people who've had years of experience in building such organizations in the community, albeit for profit, and who are using their expertise to build not-for-profit organizations instead. I'll leave it to the theological colleges to decide and work out how they think they can support that too. I'm not saying that they can't. I would be delighted if they did, but I am not a theologian, as you will all have discovered in the course of tonight.
Thank you. We've really hammered our lecturer with questions, as you can see. I think we're moving on to our last question now. Can you say more about what the city on a hill model looks like beyond the family and the relationship examples given? are there other ways we can make Christianity attractive to outsiders?
I'm sure there are. And I certainly think there are many ways in which we can make Christianity less unattractive. We give quite negative messages out to the community in many ways. The reason I emphasize family and community is because I see relationships as being so fundamental to people's well-being and happiness, and the very thing which the secular society has no way of knowing how to deliver. So local churches are communities by their nature. They are, faith is communal. And so it's something particular that I think they have to offer, which this secular world is struggling to offer. But no doubt there are many other things. And the sorts of practical care that I've been talking about, food banks and these sorts of services, gambling, counselling, support for those with alcohol addiction, these are things the churches have long done, and are other ways in which the city set on a hill reaches out and supports those who are not within its walls.
Thank you so much. Just to conclude our time together briefly, let me conclude as follows. Professor Parkinson, we sincerely thank you for being willing to share with us over these past 3 nights from the great wells of wisdom that you've established by your academic work over several decades. Turning back to the first night, you asked us to stand back and reflect on the status of the family as it's developed over the last 5 or so decades. Considering family has been complicated by certain flashpoint issues that have attracted a lot of attention and have been a source of significant conflict and division within our society. These flashpoint issues, I would suggest, based on what you've shared with us, have made us distracted from the fundamental erosion of the idea of family that's been developing over the last 70 years or so and has far more disturbing consequences. You reflected on the model proposed by Jesus in Mark 10:6-8, and you've pointed out that lifelong commitment has lifelong benefits. You've also pointed out that our recent focus on individualism has meant significant, measurable and negative impacts for children and young people. As I've already said, a disturbing outcome of Tuesday night is that the outcomes are already bad and the projections are that they're going to get worse. Last night, you focused our mind on freedom and freedoms. Again, we're tempted to see some of these things in isolation, but what has been less obvious, at least to me, and I believe with others present here, is of the intimate connection between the freedoms of religion, speech, association and conscience. And I would submit to everyone present and listening in that with Patrick's guiding hand, we now understand these connections far more clearly. In the social scene, the megaphones have been obvious. What has been less obvious is how legislation and codes have been weaponised, probably in spite of the well-meaning intentions of governance bodies and human rights legislators. As Professor Cohen pointed out on Monday night, here at the University of New South Wales we relish multiculturalism. But as Patrick has pointed out, without a firm recognition of commitment to the freedoms of religion, speech, association and conscience, multiculturalism will degrade into a sad secularism. We have been warned. Tonight, Professor Parkinson has looked at ways forward, specifically for the church and for church-based organisations. His warnings are clear. It's a mistake for the church to look for aligned power or political solutions. He's pointed to examples overseas and some of the cracks that are already emerging in Australia. So, thank you for encouraging us towards a clear-sighted appreciation of our present challenges and trends and hazards. Thank you for also encouraging us towards a firm commitment of ensuring that Christian people clearly understand the fundamentals of their faith. I think we've also graciously reflected on the kind teachings of Jesus as a beauty of Christendom and how we should be adopting that in what we think, say and do. Thank you for sharing with us your vision for a vigorous support of the vulnerable. in some of the stuff we've talked over the last few nights, particularly associated with our own families, but you've asked us to look beyond that, the families that might be struggling around us. And particularly a mission of looking towards the good of our general society. I think an important aspect of tonight is also building a vision for open communities that will welcome in increasing numbers of people who may have become disconnected from the society around them. I'm tempted to go on and say more about the wonderful things you've shared with us, but I will finish by just thanking you for your hard work on our behalf and making such complex issues crystal clear and accessible to us. Now, as part of our recognition to our new college lecturers, we do make a final presentation at their conclusion. If you're interested in the history of our lectures, there's some available free at our bookstall, and there's a much more expanded version in our beautiful new college history, which is also available there. And if you review the list of authors and publications that have emerged from the new college lectures over the last 34 years, you will see an internationally prestigious list. I'd like to acknowledge previous lectures trustees. But tonight, we wish to thank our lecturer, and under normal circumstances, I would shake his hand and present him with a very fine gold medallion. Now, just so everybody knows that it does genuinely exist, I will hold it up in the presence of witnesses to see that it does exist. There's a fine image of it on the screen. Sadly, Patrick, I'm not able to present you with that, but it's in the mail. So, thank you. So, at this point, perhaps we should applaud Patrick, and those listening on live stream are welcome to applaud as well, but sadly we won't hear you. Now, I also want to also acknowledge that often in the background of the new college lectures is some long-suffering person, and I'm hoping at this point Patrick will welcome his wife Martha to join us briefly. Hello, Martha. Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
But, you know, a lot of time is invested in preparing the new college lectures, and we certainly acknowledge Patrick's work, and I don't know how you've suffered through this process, but I certainly do know that over the past month or so, we've certainly had our ups and downs. So, look, Martha, on behalf of every one of us that's benefited directly from Patrick's lectures, and perhaps more broadly, on behalf of those who will be benefited by the impacts of him sharing these things with us tonight, I want to thank you sincerely for your role. There is a gift for you. I don't know whether you can see it, but I am holding it up at this point, and it's not an empty box. But again, we will dispatch this by courier to you very, very shortly. So please join me in publicly thanking Martha for her work.
Thank you.
I must say, finishing the lectures in this way does leave a very odd sort of feeling. Look, and in this midst of this odd sort of feeling, we're just going to say a final thank you. Thank you for being with us, and we're going to permit you now to leave our company. So, best wishes.
Thank you. Good night to all.
For those of us that remain, sincere thanks for joining us tonight and this week. We sincerely hope that the lectures are a blessing to you personally, and as well as perhaps equipping you and inspiring you to be a good influence within our society. As we finish up, just to remind you, there is our bookshop. Special deals are available tonight, including subscription to our quarterly journal. Please feel welcome to contribute to the cost of holding the lectures. There will be refreshments served shortly, I believe. Edwina is confirming that. So please feel welcome to stay and chat. I would encourage you, if you do stay, let's try and observe social distancing, perhaps sit down while you're chatting to people, but please feel welcome to stay and enjoy refreshments now. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.